Science has managed to provide us some life-changing treatments, advance our understanding of the mind, and revolutionise our medicine, and this all started thousands of years ago with our early history. But our history itself isn't just about progress, a lot of it involves cruelty. For example, for centuries or even millennia, a lot of the experiments performed to acquire this knowledge were done on children, completely unaware of the atrocities they were to face. The suffering was justified as necessary for discovery, but behind closed doors, these test subjects, going all the way back before AD, would have lifelong trauma. And as one would expect, this trend has unfortunately not really died off completely, with the last 100 years seeing some of the most barbaric experiments man has ever performed. From deliberately infecting newborns to scarring innocent children for life. Let's uncover some of the most horrific past experiments featuring children, and the lasting impact it's had, because as disturbing as these stories are, they've shaped the ethical codes we rely on today. Here's the worst experiments on children throughout history. Let's begin our exploration thousands of years ago. In trying to find the first, there's an experiment all the way back in ancient Egypt around 700 BC, in which Pharaoh Psamtik I wanted to discover the true first language of humanity. Now, this is an account from Herodotus many centuries later, and it was believed Psamtik desired to raise children in complete silence, never having hearing human speech. He thought they would speak the most ancient natural language of humankind, so he did what any of us would do. He stole 2 newborns and gave them to a shepherd, instructing the shepherd to never let them hear speech. Now, it was believed the children did actually speak their first word as bekos, which is actually a Phrygian word for bread, and good old Psamtik therefore concluded Phrygian was the first language, but he kind of forgot the point of the critical period and that it had passed. You see, the children could not speak other complex words, and we actually know this because we repeated the same one in the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th century with Frederick II. Each of his child subjects had noticeable psychological damage, and they did not speak the language of the gods. Around this time as well, humans began becoming interested in nature versus nurture. Now, this is hypothesized, and I can't find any direct evidence if fully true, but it's believed by some, and ancient Greeks at the time, that Darius I of Persia had 1 child raised in a palace and 1 in a farm to see the effects. If we fast forward the clock about 300 years, we get to the time of Hippocrates and Aristotle, who themselves laid the foundation for medicine and biology. And even though we celebrate them today, with every right to, some of their methods were a little bit questionable, reflecting on today's standards. Aristotle especially was a big fan of dissections, and even used stillborn infants, or sometimes unclaimed newborns, to use in his anatomical studies. And if we keep it in Greece, ancient Spartan culture saw an early form of early eugenics. They would examine newborns for physical flaws and leave the ones deemed as sick or weak in the wild. Then, from the age of 7, the brutal agoge system awaited. Starvation, pain, and extreme cold, all to toughen up their breed of warriors. But these warriors often had severe psychological deficits. In ancient Rome, the field had oddly fewer restrictions. Galen, probably the most famous physician of all time, and in practically every history-based Hippocampus video, supposedly even used child slaves for experimental surgeries. It was said that the antidotes and poisons were also frequently tested on the enslaved. Nero and Domitian, famously fearing assassination by poison, had physicians frequently test them on captives. Andromachus, who actually served Nero, is believed to have conducted extensive poison trials, refining the theriac antidote, a supposed universal cure for toxins. Most subjects died, as can be seen in early Chinese and Indian medicine too, because children had to ingest pretty much anything. And by the fall of the Western Roman Empire, child experimentation had already taken a dark turn. But as Europe entered the Middle Ages, religion soon came into play, and superstition is about to make the experimentation much darker. The Middle Ages were by no means better on child experimentation, and on a whole, we can say pretty much worse. Avicenna, the father of modern medicine, even recorded early instances of testing his treatments on live subjects before widespread. Islamic physicians soon took this idea to horrifying extremes, testing herbal poisons and surgical techniques on orphans. It is noticeable that Avicenna did not actually record this himself. On the other side of the world, medical experimentation flourished in the Tang and Song dynasties. Advancement in surgery had taken place and acupuncture and pharmacology were thriving. However, physicians resorted to using children in extreme trials. Children were deliberately exposed to disease such as smallpox to test inoculation methods, centuries before variolation became common, which is building an immunity through infection. Some doctors in the imperial court are said to have performed crude surgeries on infants. In an attempt to understand congenital deformations, some even cutting open live babies. Pain tolerance was also frequently examined, exposing innocent children to extreme temperatures or prolonged starvation. Similar things were also seen in India in regards to poison testing, with early Ayurvedic doctors testing poisons and antidotes on younger subjects. And if we head back to Europe, religion deeply had its grasp on it. During the Spanish Inquisition, children were often suspected of witchcraft and were prolonged to water deprivation, extreme heat and physical mutilations to force confessions. In some rare cases, inquisitors would document how long it took a child to die under certain conditions, which is a rare moment in research that's just left me speechless. But if we advance time a little more, we enter the Renaissance. The church had formerly banned human dissection, but by now, Italian universities had basically said screw this and did it anyway. Now, it is actually debated if they did dissect abandoned children. Some historians believe they did and it was rife, but others believe this isn't actually true and it was just regular corpses, which is still kind of grim. But what we do know about dissection for certain comes in the 1700s. In Britain, dissection was just made legal for research. Dr. John Hunter, one of the most infamous of the time, routinely acquired and dissected fetal and infant cadavers. Yes, his work did help shape medicine, but the looting of maternity wards would obviously not be alright today. We can also see in this time period Dr. Marion Sims, an American doctor called the father of modern gynecology. Experiments would be performed on enslaved women and children without anaesthetic. Children were used, albeit not as common as adult women, to test surgical techniques. And finally, we get the first insane asylums begin to arise. In these psychiatric asylums, by which not all against housing a wide array of children, would deliberately give innocent children ice baths, electric shocks, and sensory deprivation to children with developmental disorders. And if you think this sounds bad for the poor children, wait till you hear about the most recent experiments and practices on these innocent lives. As said, the present is by no means better in experimenting on innocent children. We can take World War II as the first main example, with the famous experiments always causing sadness that we read about all the time, such as Mengeler's twin studies, which saw children sewn together, given blood transfusion, and even swapped limbs. Some children would be even forced into ice water in winter to test hypothermia survival rates, not counting injecting with deadly diseases. Mengele is really one of the worst men of all time. In the Pacific Theatre, Unit 731 in Japan would know better. Shiro Ishii did live dissections on children to study internal organ damage. Plagues, anthrax and cholera were also given to test disease progression, and perhaps the worst of all, vivisections. Some children had their stomachs surgically removed with their esophagus reattached to their intestines. Others had their brain, lungs and liver removed. And these experiments weren't just seen within the Axis. In the US, one of the most famous studies of all time took place, called the Monster Study. In this, stuttering was basically induced in orphans through psychological abuse and trauma to see if it was learned. But instead, all the children got were severe mental health problems which were only compensated decades later. And it didn't stop following the end of World War II. In the Cold War, the US did radiation experimentations on orphaned and disabled children, injecting them with radioactive isotopes without consent to study the radiation. MKUltra and LSD testing also occurred during this, which saw children dosed with LSD to test mind control and psychological manipulation. Now, this one is rather disputed, but many claim it really happened and that children did actually die. Believe it or not, child experimentation wasn't just localised to the US. South Africa had the Aversion Project, which saw LGBTQ children subjected to electroshock therapy, hormone injections and forced sex changes, supposedly to cure their homosexuality. Whilst in Romania, studies were conducted on orphans in orphanages to show the effects of extreme deprivation. But for this one, causation is a big area for discussion. Still though, the children had permanent cognitive damage and brain atrophy. And this actually also occurred on home soil in the US and the UK too, again to study the effects of deprivation. In fighting diseases, US medical professionals routinely infected children with diseases such as Guatemalan children with syphilis to test the effectiveness of penicillin, not actually treating all of them and leaving them after. whilst others back in the States, more specifically, mentally disabled children were given measles to determine its progression, again being untreated. And finally, in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University famously studied lead contamination in family homes, not informing any family about the risks and looking at the effects in children in low-income areas. Many of these children suffered cognitive damage, learning disabilities and other health issues, which led to a lawsuit arise and the university had to pay compensation. Now, we tend to know a lot more about science now, and therefore this doesn't really happen as often, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen at all. Hopefully soon we will have put an end to this altogether. So, there we have a list of some of the worst experiments performed on children throughout history. But tell me, what are your thoughts on some of these? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. And if you don't, well, Samtic's coming for you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It's free and it really helps me out. See you next time.